announced the indictment of 15 people this morning. TBI and drug agents learned a member of the motorcycle gang known as the Pagans was...
The flaming Norse god on their leather vests should have been your first warning. When those Harley engines roar up behind you on a dark Pennsylvania highway, and you catch sight of that sword-wielding giant patch in your mirrors, every instinct screams danger. The Pagans Motorcycle Club doesn't just wear death on their backs, they live it. Law enforcement calls them the most unpredictably violent of America's Big Four motorcycle gangs. And today, we're revealing the 5 most terrifying leaders who turned this brotherhood into a reign of terror. The Pagans Motorcycle Club stands apart from other outlaw organizations for one chilling reason: their reputation for savage, unpredictable violence. While the Hells Angels might be more famous and the Bandidos larger, law enforcement officials consistently describe the Pagans as the most dangerous to encounter on the street. Founded in 1957 in Prince George's County, Maryland, the Pagans began as a small group of 13 motorcycle enthusiasts. But by the 1970s, they had transformed into a criminal empire stretching across the eastern United States. What makes them unique among outlaw motorcycle clubs is their governing structure. A mother club of exactly 13 senior members, known as the 13, who control every aspect of the organization. Unlike other major clubs, the Pagans have remained exclusively American, with no international chapters. This concentrated power base has allowed them to maintain tighter control over their territory and operations, making them incredibly efficient at both criminal enterprises and eliminating threats. Their patch depicts Surtur, the Norse fire giant who destroys the world with his flaming sword, a fitting symbol for an organization that has left a trail of violence across America's East Coast. The men who have led this organization didn't just command respect through intimidation, they earned fear through actions so brutal that rival gangs would rather avoid confrontation entirely. These 5 leaders represent decades of criminal innovation, from the expansion tactics that built the modern Pagans to the sophisticated drug operations that made them millions. Each brought their own brand of terror to the role, but all shared one common trait: an absolute willingness to use extreme violence to protect their power and territory. Number 5. Floyd Jesse Moore, the Enforcer. Floyd Jesse Moore earned his place as one of the most feared Pagans leaders not through charisma or business acumen, but through his role as the organization's primary enforcer. As national vice president in the 2000s, Moore was the man sent when the Pagans needed to make a point that couldn't be ignored. Moore's territory was West Virginia, specifically St. Albans, where he built a reputation for systematic brutality that extended far beyond typical motorcycle club violence. Unlike other leaders who delegated their dirty work, Moore took personal pleasure in demonstrating why the Pagans were feared throughout the eastern United States. Federal investigators describe Moore as the architect of the Pagans' intimidation campaigns against smaller motorcycle clubs. His method was simple but terrifying: complete subjugation or total destruction. When the Road Disciples Motorcycle Club began operating in what Moore considered pagan territory, he didn't just issue warnings. In March 2003, Moore ordered 2 of his most trusted enforcers, Daryl, Mr. Nice Guy Bumgarner, and David Kicker Cremens, to beat a Road Disciples member at a Huntington bar. But this wasn't a simple bar fight. It was a calculated message. The victim was to collect money from his club's president and deliver an ultimatum: submit to pagan authority or be shut down permanently. Moore's tactics extended beyond individual confrontations to psychological warfare. He would send teams of pagans to rival clubhouses with simple messages: disband your organization and never operate in pagan territory again. These weren't negotiations. They were commands backed by the implicit threat of violence that everyone knew Moore was capable of delivering. The most chilling aspect of Moore's leadership was his willingness to target anyone he perceived as a threat, including law enforcement informants. In September 2005, federal prosecutors charged Moore with conspiring to kill an inmate suspected of cooperating with authorities. The plan involved bribing a prison guard to facilitate the murder. Demonstrating Moore's reach extended even into secure federal facilities. Moore also conspired to murder the president of a local Avengers Motorcycle Club chapter. While these specific killings were never carried out, the mere fact that Moore was planning them sent shockwaves through rival organizations. Here was a leader who would eliminate anyone who challenged pagan supremacy, regardless of their position or protection. What made Moore particularly dangerous was his systematic approach to violence. He maintained detailed intelligence on rival clubs, tracking their leadership, operations, and vulnerabilities. When the time came to act, Moore's attacks were precisely targeted to cause maximum psychological impact while advancing pagan territorial goals. His downfall came in 2009 when federal authorities arrested 55 Pagans members and associates in a sweeping RICO investigation. Moore was charged with racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and weapons violations. In December 2009, facing overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to charges involving conspiracy to kill a woman and participating in illegal raffles. The sentencing hearing revealed the true scope of Moore's reign of terror. Federal prosecutors presented evidence of systematic intimidation campaigns spanning multiple states, with Moore at the center directing violence like a military commander. His attorneys' attempts to portray him as reformed fell flat when investigators revealed that Moore had been planning additional attacks even while under investigation. In February 2011, U.S. District Judge Thomas Johnston sentenced Moore to 4 years and 9 months in federal prison, plus a $3,000 fine and 3 years of supervised release. While relatively lenient compared to other pagan leaders, the sentence effectively ended Moore's career as an enforcer. Moore's legacy within the Pagans was his demonstration that systematic violence could be used as a business tool. His methods became the template for how the organization would handle territorial disputes and rival challenges, establishing precedents that continue to influence pagan operations today. Number 4. J. Carl Wagner, the Arsenal Master. J. Carl Wagner represents a different but equally terrifying type of pagan leadership. The military-minded strategist who understood that firepower equals power. At 66, Wagner was arrested in one of the most dramatic law enforcement operations in Pagan's history, revealing an arsenal that shocked even experienced ATF agents. On May 9, 2007, over 60 officers from state, local, and federal agencies surrounded Wagner's home in Washington County, Maryland. The operation required a bomb disposal robot, providing the first hint of what investigators would discover inside. When they breached Wagner's residence, agents found a weapons cache that read like a military supply list: 7 handguns, 13 rifles, and 2 alleged explosive devices. What made Wagner particularly dangerous wasn't just the quantity of weapons, but his expertise in their deployment. Unlike other pagan leaders who relied on intimidation or street violence, Wagner understood that modern criminal organizations needed military-grade capabilities to maintain their position in an increasingly competitive underworld. Wagner's role within the Pagans was essentially that of an arms dealer and military advisor. He supplied weapons to multiple chapters and provided tactical training to members who would serve as enforcers in territorial disputes. Federal investigators believe Wagner's influence extended far beyond his personal arsenal. He had established networks with legitimate firearms dealers and military surplus suppliers who provided the Pagans with weapons that far exceeded what typical motorcycle clubs possessed. The timing of Wagner's arrest was significant because it occurred during a period when the Pagans were engaged in an escalating conflict with the Hells Angels. Intelligence reports suggested that Wagner had been stockpiling weapons in preparation for a full-scale war between the organizations. The explosive devices found in his home weren't for personal protection. They were strategic weapons designed to destroy rival clubhouses or eliminate multiple enemies simultaneously. Wagner's background gave him unique qualifications for his role within the Pagans. Unlike many motorcycle club members who learned violence through street experience, Wagner had formal training in weapons and tactics. This expertise made him invaluable to an organization that needed to compete with increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprises. The federal investigation into Wagner revealed the extent of his weapons network. Phone records showed contacts with firearms dealers across multiple states, suggesting that Wagner wasn't just arming the Pagans, but potentially supplying other criminal organizations as well. This entrepreneurial approach to weapons trafficking demonstrated a level of business sophistication that set Wagner apart from typical club enforcers. Wagner's arrest sent shockwaves through the Pagans organization because it revealed how dependent they had become on his logistical support. Without his weapon supply and tactical expertise, individual chapters found themselves vulnerable to attacks from rivals who had previously been deterred by Pagan firepower. The psychological impact of Wagner's operations extended beyond actual weapons deployment. Rival organizations knew that confronting the Pagans meant facing an enemy with military-grade capabilities. This reputation allowed the Pagans to control territory through the threat of overwhelming violence, often without needing to fire a shot. Federal prosecutors faced unique challenges in Wagner's case because many of his weapons were technically legal to possess. The charges ultimately filed against him focused on his status as a convicted felon possessing firearms, rather than the more serious weapons trafficking crimes that investigators suspected but couldn't prove conclusively. On March 5, 2008, Wagner pleaded guilty to being a felon in possession of a firearm, acknowledging that his prior violent crime conviction prohibited him from owning the extensive arsenal found in his home. The plea agreement allowed him to avoid more serious charges that could have resulted in decades in prison. U.S. District Chief Judge Benson E. Legg sentenced Wagner to 30 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release on August 8, 2008. While the sentence was relatively modest given the scope of his operations, it effectively dismantled the weapons network that had made the Pagans one of the most feared criminal organizations on the East Coast. Wagner's legacy within the Pagans was his demonstration that modern outlaw motorcycle clubs needed to evolve beyond traditional street violence. His military approach to criminal operations influenced how the organization would structure its enforcement capabilities for years to come. Number 3. David Bart, Barbado, the criminal mastermind. David Bart. Barbado transformed the Pagans from a regional motorcycle club into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that operated across 8 states. As national president from the late 1990s until his arrest in 2009, Barbado brought a level of organizational sophistication to outlaw motorcycle gangs that law enforcement had never encountered. Unlike previous Pagan leaders who ruled through intimidation and violence, Barbado understood that sustainable criminal power required business acumen. Operating from his home in Myersville, Maryland, he established systems that would allow the Pagans to generate millions in revenue while maintaining the security necessary to avoid law enforcement detection. Barbado's most innovative creation was the Pagans' motorcycle raffle system, which became the foundation of their money laundering operation. These raffles, ostensibly legal fundraising activities, generated tens of thousands of dollars annually while providing a legitimate cover for moving drug money throughout the organization. As national president, Barbado had sole discretion over how these funds were distributed, giving him unprecedented control over chapter operations across the eastern United States. The genius of Barbado's system was its scalability. Local chapters would organize raffles in their territories, collecting cash from participants who believed they were buying chances to win motorcycles. In reality, many of these motorcycles didn't exist, and the money was immediately funneled into the organization's criminal activities. This allowed the Pagans to finance drug purchases, weapons acquisitions, and territorial expansion without creating paper trails that law enforcement could follow. Barbado's territorial strategy was equally sophisticated. Rather than engaging in open warfare with rival organizations, he focused on systematic absorption of smaller motorcycle clubs. His method involved identifying vulnerable clubs, offering them protection and support, then gradually integrating them into Pagan operations until they became dependent on the larger organization's resources. This approach allowed the Pagans to expand their territory without the publicity and law enforcement attention that typically accompanied violent takeovers. By the time rival organizations realized what was happening, the Pagans had established networks of support clubs that effectively controlled criminal activities across multiple states. The sophistication of Barbado's operations extended to his use of violence as a strategic tool rather than an emotional response. When intimidation was necessary, it was precisely calibrated to achieve specific goals. Federal investigators documented his involvement in conspiracy to commit murder, but these plots were always connected to business objectives. eliminating informants, disciplining subordinates, or removing obstacles to territorial expansion. Barbados' downfall began in October 2009 when federal agents raided his home and discovered 2 illegal firearms, a handgun with an obliterated serial number and an unregistered semi-automatic shotgun. While these weapons charges were relatively minor, they provided the legal foundation for a broader investigation into pagan operations under his leadership. The federal investigation revealed the true scope of Barbados' criminal enterprise, using wiretaps, financial analysis, and cooperating witnesses. Prosecutors documented a RICO conspiracy that spanned 8 states and involved 55 members and associates of the Pagans organization. The evidence showed that Barbados had created what federal prosecutors described as a sprawling organization engaged in kidnapping, robbery, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and other crimes. The most serious charges against Barbados involved conspiracy to commit murder. Federal prosecutors alleged that he and National Vice President Floyd Moore had conspired in September 2005 to kill an inmate suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. The plan involved bribing a prison guard to facilitate the murder, demonstrating Barbados' willingness to eliminate threats regardless of the complexity required. U.S. District Judge Thomas Johnston ruled that Barbados should remain in custody as a potential danger to the community, citing his position of power, his alleged oversight of murder conspiracies, and the weapons found during the search of his home. This decision reflected the court's recognition that Barbados represented a unique threat, a criminal leader whose sophistication made him more dangerous than typical violent offenders. In June 2010, facing overwhelming evidence, Barbados pleaded guilty to racketeering and weapons charges. The plea agreement allowed him to avoid the most serious murder conspiracy charges, while acknowledging his role as the leader of a criminal enterprise. He was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison, a relatively lenient term that reflected his cooperation with investigators and his lack of direct involvement in violent crimes. Barbados' legacy within the Pagans was his demonstration that outlaw motorcycle clubs could evolve into sophisticated criminal enterprises capable of competing with traditional organized crime families. His organizational innovations became the template for how modern motorcycle gangs structure their operations to maximize profits while minimizing law enforcement detection. 2. Christopher Lamar Baker, the Methamphetamine King. Christopher Lamar Baker represents the evolution of pagan leadership into the modern era of drug trafficking, where success is measured in the kilograms rather than territory controlled. As one of only 13 members of the 13, the Pagans' ruling council, Baker built a methamphetamine empire that stretched across multiple states and generated millions in revenue for the organization. Baker's operation in Raleigh, North Carolina, demonstrated how modern pagan leaders could leverage the club's reputation and structure to create criminal enterprises that dwarfed anything previous generations had achieved. Between 2019 and his arrest in November 2021, Baker oversaw the distribution of over 268 kilograms of methamphetamine into the Raleigh area and surrounding East Coast states. What made Baker particularly dangerous was his systematic approach to drug trafficking. Unlike street-level dealers who focused on local markets, Baker understood that sustainable criminal enterprises required sophisticated supply chains, reliable distribution networks, and robust security measures. His organization operated more like a corporation than a traditional motorcycle club. Baker's supply chain extended to Atlanta, where he maintained relationships with major methamphetamine producers. Rather than making these trips personally, which would have exposed him to law enforcement surveillance, Baker directed other Pagans members to transport him to Atlanta for drug pickups. This delegation allowed him to maintain operational security, while ensuring the loyalty of subordinates who became dependent on his organization for their income. The scope of Baker's operation required unprecedented levels of violence to maintain discipline and eliminate threats. Federal prosecutors presented evidence that Baker routinely used torture to send messages to anyone who might challenge his authority. In one particularly shocking incident, Baker ordered the fingers of a pagan pledge cut off with a table saw after the individual allegedly stole from another member. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated terrorism designed to ensure absolute loyalty within Baker's organization. The message was clear: Stealing from Baker or his associates would result in permanent disfigurement, while more serious betrayals would lead to death. The psychological impact of such extreme punishments extended far beyond the immediate victim, creating a climate of fear that prevented internal challenges to Baker's authority. Baker's willingness to commit murder was demonstrated when he ordered the death of an individual who sold him fake drugs. Rather than simply ending the business relationship or demanding compensation, Baker chose execution as his response to what he perceived as disrespect. Raleigh police and ATF had to place the intended victim in protective custody, highlighting how Baker's reach extended into civilian populations. The investigation into Baker's operation revealed the sophisticated methods he used to launder drug proceeds. Rather than simply accumulating cash, Baker invested in legitimate businesses and real estate that provided cover for his criminal income. Federal prosecutors successfully charged him with money laundering conspiracy, demonstrating that his criminal enterprise extended far beyond simple drug dealing. Baker's role within the broader Pagan organization was equally significant. As a member of the 13, he had influence over club policy and operations across multiple states. This position allowed him to coordinate with other Pagan chapters to ensure his drug distribution network could operate without interference from rival organizations or law enforcement. The weapons charges against Baker revealed another dimension of his criminal sophistication. Federal investigators found evidence that he possessed firearms in furtherance of drug trafficking crimes, including a machine gun. This level of firepower demonstrated that Baker was prepared for warfare with rival organizations or law enforcement agencies that might threaten his operations. Baker's trial in September 2022 provided unprecedented insight into modern Pagan operations. Federal prosecutors presented evidence of a criminal enterprise that generated millions in revenue through systematic violence, sophisticated money laundering, and international drug trafficking connections. The evidence showed that Baker had elevated drug trafficking within the Pagans to a level of professionalism that rivaled major cartel operations. The jury convicted Baker on 17 counts, including conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute methamphetamine, distribution of methamphetamine, possession of firearm in furtherance of drug trafficking crimes, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The breadth of these charges reflected the comprehensive nature of his criminal enterprise. On February 3, 2023, U.S. District Judge Louise Flanagan sentenced Baker to 900 months, 75 years, in federal prison. This sentence was among the harshest ever imposed on a Pagan leader and reflected the court's recognition that Baker represented a new level of criminal sophistication within outlaw motorcycle gangs. The impact of Baker's operation extended far beyond the Pagans organization. His success demonstrated that motorcycle clubs could compete with major drug cartels in terms of distribution capacity and operational sophistication. This evolution has forced law enforcement agencies to completely reassess how they approach investigations of outlaw motorcycle gangs. Baker's legacy within the Pagans was his proof that modern motorcycle clubs could generate wealth that exceeded anything their predecessors had imagined. His methods became the blueprint for how contemporary Pagan operations integrate traditional club structures with sophisticated criminal enterprises. Number 1. John Satan. Marron, the architect of terror. John Satan. Marron didn't just lead the Pagans, he created the template for everything that would make them the most feared motorcycle club in America. From the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, Marron transformed a small regional club into a criminal empire that would terrorize the eastern United States for decades to come. When Marron assumed control of the Pagans, they were still a relatively peaceful organization, focused on motorcycle culture rather than criminal activity. Under his leadership, they evolved into what law enforcement would later describe as the most unpredictably violent of America's major outlaw motorcycle clubs. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was the result of Marron's calculated decision to use extreme violence as both a business tool and psychological weapon. Marron's background provided unique preparation for his role as a criminal leader. Before joining the Pagans, he had been president of the Sons of Satan Motorcycle Club, one of central Pennsylvania's dominant motorcycle organizations. When territorial conflicts arose between the Sons of Satan and the expanding Pagans in the 1960s, Marron demonstrated the strategic thinking that would define his later leadership. Rather than engaging in costly warfare, Marron negotiated directly with Pagans President Fred "Dutch" Boerhaans. The result was more than just a peace treaty. It was a merger that brought Marron's organizational skills and the Sons of Satan's membership into the Pagan fold. This diplomatic solution demonstrated Marron's understanding that sustainable power required strategic thinking rather than simple aggression. However, Marron's true genius lay in his recognition that the motorcycle club world was about to undergo fundamental changes. The 1960s counterculture movement, the expansion of drug markets, and the increasing sophistication of law enforcement all created opportunities for organizations that could adapt quickly and ruthlessly. Under Marron's leadership, the Pagans grew from hundreds to nearly 5,000 members by the early 1970s, making them one of the largest motorcycle organizations in the world. This explosive growth wasn't achieved through traditional recruitment. Marron systematically absorbed smaller clubs, eliminated rivals, and established territories that stretched across multiple states. Marron's expansion strategy became the template that other outlaw motorcycle clubs would follow for decades. He identified geographic regions where legitimate authority was weak, established pagan chapters with sufficient firepower to control local criminal markets, then used the profits from those markets to finance further expansion. This systematic approach to territorial conquest was unprecedented in the motorcycle club world. The violence associated with Marron's operations was strategic rather than random. Every act of brutality served multiple purposes: eliminating immediate threats, deterring future challenges, and building the psychological reputation that would allow the Pagans to control territory through fear rather than constant physical presence. Federal investigators believe Marron was personally involved in ordering multiple murders during his tenure as national president. While specific charges were difficult to prove due to the organization's security measures, the pattern of violence that emerged wherever pagan chapters established themselves suggested systematic killing rather than spontaneous conflicts. Marron's organizational innovations extended beyond military tactics to sophisticated business operations. He established the Mother Club structure that gave the Pagans centralized leadership, while maintaining operational flexibility at the local level. This system allowed the organization to coordinate activities across multiple states while insulating senior leadership from local law enforcement investigations. The psychological impact of Marron's leadership extended far beyond the pagan organization itself. Rival motorcycle clubs learned to avoid territories where the Pagans were established. Law enforcement agencies allocated additional resources to regions with those pagan chapters, and civilian populations in areas with pagan presence lived with the constant awareness that extreme violence could erupt without warning. Marron's downfall came in the mid-1970s when he was convicted of maiming and homicide charges. The specific details of these crimes remain sealed, but federal prosecutors describe them as representative of Marron's systematic use of violence to maintain organizational discipline and eliminate threats to pagan supremacy. Even from prison, Marron's influence over the Pagans continued. His organizational structure remained intact, his operational methods were passed down to successive generations of leadership, and his reputation continued to provide the psychological foundation for pagan power throughout the eastern United States. The legacy of Marron's leadership can be seen in every aspect of modern pagan operations. The club's territorial control methods, their systematic violence, their absorption of smaller organizations, and their resistance to law enforcement pressure all trace back to innovations Marron implemented during his tenure as national president. What made Marron the most feared pagan leader of all time wasn't just his personal capacity for violence. It was his understanding that sustainable criminal power required systematic brutality, strategic thinking, and organizational sophistication. He created not just a motorcycle club, but a criminal enterprise that would continue to terrorize communities long after his imprisonment. Law enforcement officials consistently describe the modern Pagans as Marron's creation, an organization that embodies his vision of how criminal enterprises should operate in American society. His methods became the blueprint that other outlaw motorcycle clubs would attempt to follow, though none achieved the level of feared reputation that Marron built for the Pagans. These 5 leaders represent more than just individual criminals. They embody the evolution of organized crime in America. From John Satan Marron's creation of the modern pagan template to Christopher Baker's sophisticated drug empire, each leader adapted the club's core violence to the challenges and opportunities of their era. What makes the Pagans unique among outlaw motorcycle clubs isn't just their willingness to use extreme violence, but their leaders' understanding that such violence must be systematic, strategic, and ultimately profitable. Unlike other organizations that use intimidation reactively, Pagan leaders have consistently employed terror as a proactive business tool. The influence of these 5 men extends far beyond their individual tenures. Their methods, structures, and strategic innovations continue to influence not just the Pagans, but outlaw motorcycle clubs throughout America. Law enforcement agencies still use their cases as training examples for understanding how modern criminal enterprises operate. Today's Pagans, under current leadership, continue to embody the principles these 5 men established, that criminal power flows from the systematic application of extreme violence, and that such violence becomes most effective when it's unpredictable, overwhelming, and absolutely without mercy. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, no organization has produced leaders more feared than these 5 architects of terror.